On December 26, 1900, Joseph Moore braved the howling wind and battering rain and stepped onto the remote island. He climbed the steps of a lighthouse expecting to find 3 keepers in the watchroom. Instead, he found no one. The lamps were unlit, the doors were shut, and the keepers had vanished. It would become one of the most bizarre mysteries in modern history. A story of ghosts, spies, and strange logbook entries that will make your skin crawl. The Flannan Isles in Scotland's Outer Hebrides are about as remote as you can get on the British Isles. With a population of 0, the islands sit under near-constant winds, where giant North Atlantic swells can make landing impossible for days, sometimes weeks. The Lighthouse was commissioned in 1895 after many vessels were lost to storms. The seas were so rough that it took 4 years to complete. And in December 1900, the weather was atrocious. On the 15th, a steamer traveling from Philadelphia to Leith noticed that it could not see the glow of the lighthouse. Perched on the highest point of Ellen Moor, the building was cloaked in darkness, a serious danger to any vessel passing through the area. The ship's captain reported the dark lighthouse upon reaching port, but the message never reached the Northern Lighthouse Board. It wasn't until the 26th of December that the lighthouse tender, Hesperus, reached the island. Captain James Harvey blew the ship's horn expecting the 3 keepers to appear on the hill. No one did. He ordered a flare to be fired. It burst above the lighthouse. Still, no one appeared. Keeper James Duckett, along with the first assistant Donald MacArthur and the second assistant Thomas Marshall, were known to be reliable. They were very tough men, but lighthouse work was taxing. The schedule was 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, with 4 men in total in a rotation schedule. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper that day, stepped onto the landing platform, expecting the man he was relieving to be waiting. He was greeted with nothing but an eerie silence. This was highly unusual, so with the rain lashing his cheeks, Moore braced himself and set off up the hill, scaling the 160 stairs to the lighthouse entrance. When he walked through the door, he found the living quarters and the storehouse empty. The beds hadn't been made, and the ashes in the fire were cold. Even the clock on the wall had stopped. Moore shuddered, thinking about the old stories that he'd heard about this place, that the island was home to a malevolent spirit. In the past, shepherds would bring their flocks here. The island could supposedly cure a diseased animal. It could even help a sheep give birth to healthy twins. But the shepherds followed one rule: you don't ever stay overnight. It was superstition, and Moore knew it, but he also knew that Duckett, the principal keeper, would have never left the lighthouse unmanned or ignore a ship's call. With a wife and 4 kids at home, Duckett was a man you could trust. For 20 years he had been a keeper, and in that time he would rarely, if ever, make a mistake. MacArthur, 40, was also an experienced keeper with a family at home. Marshall was only 28 and lacked the experience of the others. He was the kind of man who might get restless, maybe panic, and make mistakes. Moore returned to the Hesperus, and soon the crew was searching for the missing men. They checked every outbuilding, every nook and cranny of the cliff, but there were very few places to hide on an island so remote that getting to and from it required professional help. None of it made any sense. Men don't just vanish. What made it even more perplexing was that one of the men's oilskin jackets was still hanging on a peg in the living quarters. It was MacArthur's. There was no way in the middle of winter he would have left the lighthouse without it. But his boots were gone, as were the other men's. Did this mean they had rushed out in a panic and never made it back? That might also explain why there was half-eaten food in the kitchen and why one of the chairs had been knocked over. The ship sent a telegram back to the mainland. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Captain Harvey could only speculate about what had happened. He wrote, "Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane." But when investigators from the Northern Lighthouse Board arrived, the idea that the men had simply been blown off a cliff made little sense. The more they examined the site, the stranger the case became. The iron staircase leading down to the landing platform was twisted and damaged. Harvey had mentioned the crane because the ropes and jibs on the platform were scattered as if something had violently pounded it. A supply crate lay on the cliffside, its contents strewn about, beside a boulder weighing at least a ton that had been displaced. The storms that week had been severe, but storms don't usually move rocks of that size. Further up the cliff, turf had been torn from the ground and dragged back at least 30 feet. If you were a superstitious sort, and many were in those days, you would think the island had been attacked by a giant sea serpent or some kind of wicked spirit. When investigators found the logbooks, that explanation did not sound so unreasonable. One of the final entries, dated December 12th, was written by the younger keeper, Thomas Marshall. He noted that they were experiencing, quote, "severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. That alone was unusual. But it wasn't the most disturbing part. Marshall wrote that his superior, James Duckett, had been very quiet. He wasn't the sort of man to withdraw into himself in bad weather. The entry ended by saying Donald MacArthur had been crying. These were very hardened men. They absolutely did not cry during storms. MacArthur was an old hand who had lived through hundreds, possibly thousands of gales. Back on the mainland, he was known as a brawler in the local taverns, the kind of man who fought for fun. It made no sense at all that he would start sobbing over the wind and rain. Then came the entry for December 13th. Marshall wrote that the men were huddled together in the watchroom, praying as the storm battered the island. Yet they were more than 150 feet above sea level, inside a thick concrete building stocked with food and warm clothing. This was a modern lighthouse. Even in a hurricane, they would have been secure, and they would have known it. So why were they praying? What had they seen? And if that wasn't strange enough, weather reports from the mainland said that there had been some rough storms, but they had started on December 17th. From the 12th to the 14th, when these hard experienced men were apparently crying and praying, the weather had been unusually calm. The question was Marshall lying, and if so, why? What was he covering up? His final entry was on December 15th when he had written, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." What could he have been trying to say? Robert Muirhead, the Lighthouse Board superintendent, focused on the hard evidence. The evidence suggested they had all gone out together, something they knew was against regulations. Whatever had happened must have involved the damage below the crane and the smashed crate. Had the men been trying to retrieve it when they were suddenly swept into the sea? That's what Muirhead thought when in his official report he wrote, "I am of the opinion that a large body of water going higher than where the men were and then coming down upon them had swept them away with resistless force." But there was much more going on. The story was just beginning, and it was going to get very strange. When Muirhead's conclusion reached the newspapers, it was met with scrutiny from the locals. Would three men with decades of experience really have failed to notice a huge wave approaching? Would one of them really have gone outside in freezing conditions wearing only a cotton shirt in the middle of December? And where were the bodies? Then there was the biggest problem of all. People talked about how the sea had been calm on the day the men were believed to have been taken by a huge wave. As for Marshall's strange logbook entries about crying and praying, they made no sense to anyone who knew the men. It was insulting to those men's good names and their families. For many locals who had grown up in such a wild and isolated place, the explanation could only mean one thing: a supernatural force. The island was home to the ruins of a chapel once associated with Flannan Mac Torobig, later known as St. Flannan. For centuries, pilgrims had visited the island, and they had done so with care not to rankle the local spirits. Anyone who set foot there was said to remove their hat and slowly turn in a full circle upon reaching the hilltop. These islands were once known as the Seven Hunters. The rituals were said to ward off what the locals called the Phantom of the Seven Hunters. This was a spirit believed to haunt the place since pre-Christian times, when the Picts were said to have used the islands as a burial ground. It was these ancient and restless souls that demanded respect. They were the reason medieval peasants brought sheep there to graze, but they were cautious not to upset the dead. Centuries later, those fears still lingered. When the lighthouse was built at the end of the 19th century, finding men willing to work there was difficult. No one wanted to stay on the island alone at night. Many believed that it was cursed, and that's why so many ships had been wrecked in the surrounding waters. Joseph Moore, the keeper who was due in the rotation, certainly fueled the angry ghost theory. After returning to the mainland and speaking to newspapers, he claimed that the moment he stepped onto the island, he felt a dark presence and an overwhelming sense of melancholy. But the paranormal explanation could have been embellished. A 1912 poem invented details, such as the overturned chair and the uneaten meal. Despite the fact that British media reported that part, there was never any evidence that it was true. While there is no doubt the islands were surrounded by superstition, it's hard to know which part of those ancient spirit stories was a modern invention, so it's unlikely the men were taken by angry spirits. But what about the logbook? Word for word on December 12th, Marshall wrote, "Sea lashed to fury. Never seen such a storm. Waves very high, tearing at lighthouse. James Duckett irritable." Marshall said he saw another ship. Cannot go out. Ship passing sounding foghorn. Could see lights of cabins. Duckett quiet. Donald MacArthur crying. If that is true, the men didn't leave the safety of the lighthouse, but it was not long after that they were praying and about to vanish. How can that be explained? First, there was speculation that Marshall could have been lying. and the three men were picked up by a ship to start new lives in a far-off country. But why? Two of the men were married with children, so it's doubtful they'd abandon their families. Then there was a theory that the men were taken by foreign spies. Maybe those spies had forced Marshall to write in the logbook, or maybe it was a criminal case. Newspapers at the time speculated that one of the men could have killed the other two because of some crime and was then picked up by his criminal friends. Could there have been something valuable in the crate that was smashed open? There's another possible criminal element to the story. Three men alone on a rock for weeks on end can lead to arguments, and MacArthur had a notorious temper. People on the mainland said one wrong word and he was the kind of man to strike out. Did he kill one man with a punch and the other was going to report him? There was literally nowhere to run. MacArthur could have killed them both and thrown their bodies into the sea. Alternatively, all three could have had a brawl and fallen off the edge of the cliff. But before you consider that theory, we should ask if the logbook entries were even real. The first time we hear about them is in a book by the journalist Vincent Gaddis, the man who helped popularize paranormal mysteries and later coined the term Bermuda Triangle. In the 1960s, he was taken half seriously while thrilling audiences with strange stories, but today his reputation is not exactly stellar. His work is often criticized for exaggeration, poor to no sourcing, and outright lies. Anyone who has spent time at sea knows that official logbooks record the bare minimum. They are not diaries. They exist to document conditions such as weather, visibility, and routine operations, not emotions or interpersonal tensions. Even allowing for the fact that this was a lighthouse rather than a ship, it's doubtful that a young subordinate keeper in 1900 would write very unflattering personal remarks about his superiors in an official record. So where did those logbook entries come from? Gaddis claimed his source was an article titled True Strange Stories published in August 1929. Its author, Ernest Fallon, said he had obtained details of the logbook from, quote, English sources, but he didn't identify them, provide copies, or explain how he accessed the material. No original document has ever been produced. So basically, he was just saying, just trust me. If you look at the Northern Lighthouse Board's own archives, the story is a little bit different. According to the board, the final entry was made on December 13th and was not written in the logbook at all. It was chalked onto a slate to be transferred later. It contains no references to men crying, praying, or fearing death. These details do not appear in the official record. They were almost definitely the product of sensational journalism in the early 20th century. That still leaves a major question unanswered. How did three experienced men disappear? And why was there clear evidence of violent damage when the weather was widely reported as calm and storm-free? Let's look at a likely scenario. Duckett and Marshall were outside working on the crane. The weather was fair, but that doesn't always mean the sea is calm. Even in good conditions, large waves can roll in, especially in this part of the North Atlantic. Local squalls or even the interaction of multiple wave systems can generate unusually large waves. Events like that would not necessarily have been detected by mainland weather stations. Maybe the two men were working below when MacArthur saw a huge wave approaching. He didn't stop to put on his coat because he didn't have time. He knew very well that because of the island's gullies, ledges, and sea caves, a large wave could strike the rocks, explode upward, and then surge back out again. The men, equipment, and even the turf could be dragged with it. We also know that Marshall had recently been fined for losing equipment during a gale. If conditions had briefly worsened, the men may have been outside securing or refixing gear. In that case, MacArthur would have to run out to warn them, and they all were swept away. A more likely version is that one man was taken first. MacArthur ran to help, and then he and the second man were caught by another rogue wave. Rogue waves don't always come in ones. There are reports of 2 or 3 extreme peaks coming one after another before the interference collapses the swell. The phenomenon is sometimes called a rogue wave train. In the past, waves like this have taken out giant ocean liners and sunk mobile offshore drilling units only for the sea to become calm right after. That is the most likely explanation, although people online have asked how a rogue wave could rip out the turf 150 feet in the air when they don't usually grow bigger than 100 feet. The answer is a significantly large enough wave could have reached that high after exploding against the cliff. As for bending an iron railing, well, that is pretty strange. But if the wave was powerful enough to dislodge a large boulder, it could have been powerful enough to drag something heavy against the railing. It would need to be a huge wave, but it's possible. In 1861, at the Lighthouse on Eagle Island off of Ireland's west coast, a rogue wave smashed the windows after climbing a 130-foot cliff and surging another 85 feet. Now imagine Marshall, Duckett, and MacArthur, much lower than that, being hit while standing on the side of a cliff. Surely it was game over. We'll never know for certain, and now that the lighthouse is automated, it will never happen again.